Welcome back to the TWTL podcast. I'm Chris Ferris, and this is our continuing coverage of Above All 2018. In the last week, I've been involved in 4 practices, official practices, and several other conversations and run-throughs. And it's just, it's been hitting the ground running. Last year, we eased into practices, especially for the apostles, because we had time, and we also didn't have an extra special event where we're getting to take a couple of our scenes on the road in Above All this year that was looming over us. So we've been meeting more, and our practices have been more intense this year at the start than last year. Now, last year, when we got closer to performances, we were hitting our points really good, but this year our early practices feel like last year's late practices. And what's a good thing about that is by the time we get to Above All, we're going to be so intense and dialed in that it's probably going to be the best performance by our grouping since Above All was created 4 or 5 years ago. I think this is the 4th production of Above All, and that's what I'm expecting. And the closeness of our group has been really strong. Many of the apostles in this group have been in it since the beginning. This is my 2nd year in it, but I've known most of the guys that are involved as apostles. I've known them over half my life. So we've already got close bonds. We've been through tough times. We've been through good times. And we've been through all kinds of in-between times. And so we know each other, and we're able to trust each other. And in our practices, something that I don't have in the recaps is it's not just 1 or 2 guys leading and directing. While we have a couple of clear-cut leaders in our group, everybody has the opportunity to share their ideas, their thoughts, both on how something should be presented, but also our spiritual thoughts. I mean, in our very first meeting, 3 or 4 guys came forward with some heartfelt thoughts from their study in the Word and what they've been praying about and what they've been fasting about. And our group was more than willing to receive whatever they had to say. There's no judgments there. And we have a text group, and when we have one of us goes through a situation, we're sharing that situation, and as soon as we get it, we're all going to prayer for them and uplifting them and encouraging them. We're all reading the Word and really focusing in on the interactions of the apostles with Jesus, but also reading the Word for greater understanding of God so that when we go into this production, we're spiritually minded. We're fasting. All of us are fasting something throughout this production. And that's not to glorify us. It's just to kind of pull back the curtain and reveal this is what it takes to put on a production that is not just practically presented well, but spiritually presented to the best of your ability. Is you've got to make sacrifices. You've got to push back. And I mean, you're going to push back from time with your family anyways. So you might as well invest spiritually as well. And that's something that our group has done. And I know that the Romans do it as well. I've never been a Roman, but I've got a lot of friends who are Romans in this production, and they say that their prayer meetings are very intense. And that's pretty impressive, because these are the guys who are supposed to beat up Jesus. These are the guys who are supposed to crucify Jesus. And yet they have some of the strongest and most important prayer meetings in this throughout this production. And they are dialed in and focused on God. And a lot of people who join up Above All, who are not necessarily dialed into a walk with God, choose to be Romans because it's a fun thing to do, and they end up in a relationship with God as a result. So it's a great witnessing tool as well. Now, some of the scenes that we've gone over so far, I know I recapped the Last Supper scene, and I recapped Mary of Bethany scene, and it's not just because I got to eat in both those scenes. It's just those were the ones where we were really doing a lot of work on this last 2 weeks. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about those two scenes because I hit them in the recaps, and there's links in the recap to those recaps here in the description of the video. But we also went over the Garden of Bethany scene, not Garden of Bethany, Garden of Gethsemane scene, when Jesus is betrayed, and we also went over the To Whom Shall We Go scene, where the disciples are talking about what's happened in the temple and where's the next steps for Christ's mission at with all the tumult and chaos that's going on. Are we, what's on the horizon for us, and what's on the horizon for Jesus and this mission that we've been on for 3+ years now. And because we weren't able to go into too much great detail, we did run through both scenes. I can tell you that these are kind of, even though they're scenes that we've done in past years, they're scenes that we're working on to improve. We're working on to improve the Last Supper. We're working on to improve Mary and Bethany. We want to make, even though the presentation of Above All has been great all 3 years so far, we want to better it and tweak it to improve it, the presentation of it, to make sure we've got the biblical accuracy down. We've got the spiritual depth down, but we want to tweak it and make sure that what's being presented is as impactful to the audience as possible. And so one thing that Brother Keith, Keith Sklusacek, who is the main director, talked about is making sure that in To Whom Shall We Go, as the scene develops, it starts with a simple conversation and then develops into a larger conversation, and that would make the scene draw the audience in rather than just everybody jumping into the conversation and you're just watching a conversation. By having it develop and people kind of get the understanding of what we're talking about within our own group as it goes along, it's going to kind of pique the interest of the audience. And they've tweaked that scene a little bit too this year. We haven't got to see it all yet because we haven't been able to perform it on stage yet. We had to perform it in a tight, confined space, just like with the Last Supper. But it's going to be interesting because everybody is trying to make sure that their physical position is in the right place, but also where we're at mentally, trying to put ourselves in that places where you're confused and you're concerned, but you're also just trying to go about a regular routine, and then it develops into one of those big conversations. And there's some pretty important things being mentioned in that scene from the apostles and from Jesus, and we want to make sure that each one of those lines that's being presented is hits home with the audience. And so just the very act of, when do I come in on the conversation? And what am I doing up until I come in on that big conversation? It's important. And so it's the little details that we're trying to already get hammered out at the beginning. Since we already know the major framework that we're working with, it allows us to tinker. And then the garden scene, which is a big, complex scene because it requires a lot of movement. There's a lot of, it's a rising tension that's going on because it's a regular, we're walking into the garden, and then there's a argumentative conversation that happens between Peter and Jesus. We're all involved in that, and then we have to try and settle back down because we're trying to portray our exhaustion because we've been traveling constantly, and it's really late at night, and we're also very concerned for Jesus, and we're having to portray that combination of exhaustion, concern, hopefulness, a physical, spiritual, mental exhaustion, all in a very short time frame, less than what it happens in the Bible. It happened over the course of over an hour, the Garden of Gethsemane scene, and we're having to portray it in a few minutes, and that's very difficult to do. And they've also tweaked how this scene's going to go this year without giving any spoilers. It's just going to be a lot more action, and they're going to have some of the actors spread around a little bit more, and there's going to be different reactions that happen in the betrayal portion of the scene. and it's gonna be pretty gripping. And I'm excited because I'm not just in my regular position huddled around with a bunch of the apostles and other Jews that are on the stage. Like last year, they've got to spread out, and one of mine is that I'm almost hanging off the stage, and I'm worried that I'm going to get stabbed by a Roman. And I'm also trying to hold back somebody else that's wanting to hurt Judas. And so there's a lot of different things that I have to do physically in this scene. And there's different things that people have to do audibly and physically in the scene that they didn't do last year. So there's a lot of little tweaks that change your approach to it. And because it's such a big scene, it's going to take 2 or 3 run-throughs to get everything that we normally have down pat, much less this new stuff. And another thing that makes it difficult is this is one of those scenes where you have multiple groups of actors. You know, we have the apostles there, we have select Jews there, we have the priests there, we have Roman soldiers there. And that's 4 different groups that don't always mingle with each other in regular practices. We don't ever hardly practice with the Romans except in this scene. This is one of the ones where we actually talk with Romans in between the takes and practices of the scene, and we're trying to coordinate with them, but most of the time we're separate from the Romans. Most of the time we're separate from the priests in talking between scenes. It doesn't mean that we don't get along with each other outside of practice, and it doesn't mean that when we're doing a full day practice that we won't at times have a conversation with each other. Last year I remember I got to know a guy named Guido really well backstage, and he was a Roman. And we got to really, he was a blessing to me from hearing his story, and I was a blessing to him from being able to tell my story. This is from last year during the production, and we created the bond there. So backstage, Roman and Jew, it doesn't matter who you are. We're all on the same team trying to portray life of Christ. But when you're getting those early practices, you're working with people that you're just not familiar working with on a regular basis. So this can be, because you're coming with different perspectives and different approaches at first, and this is where having a crack directorial team is important. And Keith Skluzacek, Roger Skluzacek are excellent at getting people organized and directed. And we have a lot of younger directors that are helping us as well. And a lot of other sub-directors that are helping us as well. And they work with us individually, and they work with the group as a whole. And it takes lots of times. I mean, for instance, that Mary of Bethany scene, we went through it about 15 times. And it's a few, maybe 2 or 3 minute scene. Well, imagine how many times we're going to have to really get into just portions of the betrayal scene. Because just like with the Last Supper, it's a bunch of moments incorporated into one big scene. You've got segments, and you have to react differently in those segments, and we have to get ourselves mentally and spiritually and emotionally prepared for those. And those are very, very difficult things to do. And as an apostle, I've found that this is just as probably the most taxing thing, is trying to prepare yourself to convey a myriad of complex emotions and complex reactions, and having to be, your mindset is just kind of being thrown around constantly within the framework of the scene. It's taxing, and that's why it takes prayer, and that's why it takes a brotherhood, and thankfully we have that with our group. And each day, each practice, I'm getting to know, even though I know these guys, I'm getting to know them even better, and I try to spend time with one differently on an individual basis, talking with them and getting to know them better. And it's just a great group of guys to work with, and this is a great production. And tonight we're going to go back through the betrayal scene, and I'm going to give a full recap of that. And now that I'll have more details to give, and having gone through it twice, we didn't even get to the scene where we're running off the stage and Jesus is pulled off the stage, because it's such a complex scene. We only went through about half of it, maybe 2/3. So we'll probably finally get to go through it all tonight, and I'll be able to give you a recap later on, maybe if not tomorrow, definitely Wednesday. But with that in mind, the only other thing I could plug is, if you haven't checked out our Peculiar Glory by John Piper review, go check it out on our website. I was going to do a full audio review, but this Above All stuff has been really taking up my time, and I'm so grateful that it has. So we'll just do a written review on that, but it's pretty extensive, and I give my thoughts. Spoiler: it's a book worth getting, but go read my thoughts on it, and maybe when you pick up the book or download it off of John's website, you can give me your thoughts. So with that in mind, I'm Chris Ferris. We're continuing our coverage of Above All 2018. I'll be back on the stage tonight practicing the betrayal scene. Hopefully I don't get my head cut off. This is Chris Ferris. God bless. Keep searching.